Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into a little bit of an overview of what the NFL draft will hold for us over the next couple of months, and Anthony had a good question here. What pass rusher fits at number 13 right across from Chop Robinson down there in Miami? The two names that came to my mind right when you said that were Mykel Williams, if he is still on the board, which will be a question if he's still on the board there at 13, but if he is, I would absolutely take him there. And then I do think Shamar Stewart is a guy that you might be taking a little bit earlier than he would go for other teams, but I think he's a very talented guy that you put him across from Chop Robinson, it could be a terrifying duo that makes life nightmares for all offenses across the league. But I've also seen them possibly go offensive tackle, like a Kelvin Banks is still on the board or a Josh Simmons is still on the board. Maybe they'll take them there just to give him a left tackle for the next 5 or 6 years. So definitely some different options for Miami, but edge rusher or offensive tackle, I feel like are the two choices that they'll be kind of weighing over the next couple of months. But let's get into these quarterbacks because it's a hard group to put together because it's just not the strongest quarterback class that you've ever seen by any means. There's definitely some guys on here that I really like and I think can become great players. There's no one on here that I think is a slam dunk. There's no one on here that I think are going to be absolute game changers from start to finish. I don't think there's guys that are going to burst onto the scene and tear people to pieces. Frankly, I'd be a little bit surprised if the rookie of the year was a quarterback next year. I think there's too many talented guys at running back and wide receiver for them to break through. And that being said, I do think there are talented guys, and I think there are guys that could develop into really long-term vets at the next level. So let's go ahead and kick it off here in. We'll start with Curtis Rourke. The quarterback over at Indiana had an incredible year this year, and I think he could end up being a steal. He stands at 6'5", 223, can make a ton of throws. Now, there are some big issues there. I think the big time thing that I have with him is making those big time accuracy throws into tight windows. Now, it's not to say that he's not capable of doing that, but when you look back at the Notre Dame game or you look back at the Ohio State game, and some of this was game planning, some of this was him, so it's not all on him necessarily, but there are bits of that game where it felt like the only throw that he felt confident throwing, or he felt, confident over and over throwing, was back shoulders or slants. It wasn't necessarily anything dynamic. It wasn't necessarily anything down the field like a deep crosser over a linebacker and under a safety, or, an out corner that you have to hit in the stride and make sure you're getting your guy in bounds. Those are just aren't throws that really jump off the page for Curtis Rourke. Now, I think he has all the ability in the world, and I also think he has stuff in between the ears that not everyone in this class has. So I do think he has an ability to really fly up these boards, and I think in those interviews for the NFL draft, he's going to wow people. I think he has a great head on his shoulders, and he's dealt with a lot of different stuff. I think he's going to be a guy that gets drafted, and we'll see what happens from there. I'd be a little bit surprised if he developed into a full NFL starter in the future, but it would not surprise me at all if he ended up being a 10-year NFL veteran just because he was a very solid backup that came in and played really solid football for you when you needed it. So that'll be a really interesting guy to watch. Don't necessarily have the highest of hopes for him at the next level, but definitely a guy that I think, given the right situation, could do some really great things. Kyle McCord is the guy that I'm watching the most, if I'm being totally honest, because I don't think he's going to crack up into the QB3 or QB4 talk. I do think he could be relatively close to the next group. Now, I put him a little bit lower here because I am worried about some of the different things with him, including how does he deal with pressure. He's not necessarily the most athletic guy in the world, and he's definitely a guy that can get a little bit out of his game a little bit early in one. And when you look back at that Pitt game earlier this year, he was all over the place, and it happened very early on, and he just couldn't find his feet again. That is a big-time issue, and if you have those blow-up games in the NFL, you don't just, move on to the next week, brush yourself off. You get benched, and you get moved on from. So it's one of those things that he's got to learn from that. He's got to be able to dial back some of the energy. The swagger that he plays with is a great thing for him. You also got to dial it back at different times and make sure your confidence isn't getting the best of you. So very talented quarterback. I think he could develop into a really good player, but I tend to believe the blow-up games would just be a little bit too much for him at the next level. Riley Leonard is the guy that a lot of people have fallen in love with over the last little bit, and I'm kind of a part of that group. Now, I've a little bit more tempered expectations because of the passing ability. I don't know if he has that NFL arm talent. I don't know if he can make those NFL throws, as it were, that a lot of people talk about. That being said, the athleticism gives a huge leg up and a great starting point to build from in this league. And you look around the league, you have a lot of guys that walk in as not polished passers, as not complete players that have that athletic ability, and it gets them far enough. It gets them to a place where they can develop that passing ability. Now, I don't want to make this comparison because I don't necessarily think he's going to be this type of player. but it's kind of like a Josh Allen type situation. Josh Allen coming out of the draft was a very inaccurate, very questionable quarterback, but had tons of physical tools. He had tons of things that you really like. Now, the arm talent is a little bit different for Riley Leonard than it was for Josh Allen, but he is a guy that is going to have that athleticism, have that physicality that you can build from at least for a couple of years, and then we'll see what happens. I don't think he's going to be a starter right away. I'd be a little bit surprised if he broke through early on in his career, but he's definitely a guy that, given the right situation and given him taking the right steps forward, maybe kind of bursts onto the scene in his second year and becomes one of the better quarterbacks in this class. Then we have Jaylen Miler. I'm not buying the same thing that everyone else is with Jaylen Miler. I really like his athleticism. It is as good as just about any single player you will find in the entire draft class, not just the quarterbacks. This is one of the most athletic players in college football. He will now be one of the most athletic players in the NFL, period, end of story. That being said, it's an Anthony Richardson problem. I really like Anthony Richardson. I think the ability is out of this world, and I think he can be a very good quarterback. It's just going to take too long. It's just going to take too long for him to find his way when it comes to accuracy, when it comes to preparation, when it comes to all the different things that are a problem for him. No doubt about that. There's definitely things that you look at him and you say, man, this is a really fun college quarterback, but at the next level, DCs are going to eat him alive. That's the reality of his situation right now. But all that being said, the athletic ability is insane. The athletic ability gives you a certain moniker where teams are going to be willing to take that risk on you, and I would be willing to take that risk on him because I think the kid is absolutely incredible. I think he's going to tear apart NFL interviews as well because I think he has the best head on his shoulders as maybe anyone in this entire draft class, and I think he's a guy that really is more than willing to learn and more than willing to get better. But at the end of the day, I'd be a little bit surprised if he became a long-term quarterback at this level. And as Anthony said, I don't necessarily think he's an outright running back at the next level. I do think if you wanted to use him as kind of a Taysom Hill type guy, wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. Bring him in on Wildcat and just let him do what he does. That being said, I do think he can develop into a guy that, given the right situation, in the right place with the right guys, and a little bit more development in that pass game, maybe he can make that stride. But as of right now, he looks like another Anthony Richardson to me, and that's something that we've seen before. Dillon Gabriel here at 6, and the big issue with Dillon Gabriel as we get over to the Combine is going to be his size. I can absolutely promise you that. People will make a huge deal out of his size the same way they did with Bryce Young, and you could argue they were right or wrong about that. Bryce Young started the kind of resurgence in his career, and I think he's going to have a great year next year, so that'll be something interesting to watch. He does have a strong arm, given that small size. The arm is not necessarily the issue. Now, I do have a little bit of an issue with he hasn't necessarily been forced to push the ball downfield too much. So the question becomes, you can throw it really hard, you can throw it really far, and that's all well and good. Can you make those throws consistently is a problem. And I definitely do think when you look back at Oregon this year, they did enough pushing the ball downfield, but Will Stein in that offense is all about, finding the open guy, getting that 5 yards, and then tacking on another 5 yards. And then you get that one explosive because you get the ball in the hands of an elite wide receiver that makes a play after the catch. So I do think he's a guy that when you get into the NFL, you're going to have to make those throws over and over and over again. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to do that. I don't expect him to be a long-term NFL starter. I fully expect him to be a long-term NFL player. I think he's a very, very smart player, and I think he's a guy that, if you needed him to come in for a spot start here and there, could play some really good football for you. So I think he's a guy that will definitely stick around in the NFL, but I do think the size mixed with some of the quote-unquote NFL throws that would have to be made will probably hold him back from being a long-term starter. I got Quin Uy here at 5, and this is one that probably the most polarizing quarterback in the entire group, at least on the field, because I could see him being QB3 for some teams and then QB10 for other teams, if I'm being totally honest. I think the big issue with him is going to be the footwork and the pocket presence. No two ways about that, and you look beyond that, I don't want to say there's no other issues with him, because there definitely are other issues, but let's say he figures out the footwork. Let's say he spends the next 3 months just building out his base, doing a ton of squats, making sure he has a much more stable base going into the next level. A lot of the stuff that we get mad about him for are going to go away. The floating of balls, that's not going to be there anymore because a lot of the power is going to be coming from his lower half, not just from his arm. And I think a lot of the pocket mobility stuff is going to get a little bit better because he's going to have a stronger base to work from. And he's not going to fall into sacks. He's not going to, have to be able to get out of one guy and then immediately when another guy pops up, he's down. So I do think there's an ability where if you fix that one problem, if you build out a stronger base over these next 2 months as you get over to the draft, I think he could shock some people. And I think, say he goes to the Rams or the Raiders or the 49ers, I think those could be situations where he could very well thrive, and I think the arm talent is very, very good. Now, the arm strength leaves a little bit to be desired, but again, I really think it all starts with that base. If he can find a way to get a little bit stronger in his legs, feel a little bit more coming from his legs in his throwing motion, I think he could be a very dangerous player that shoots up the boards. But definitely a guy to watch. I think another guy that will do incredible in those interviews, and someone will fall in love with this kid. I think he could go first round, late or early second round, if I'm being honest. Will Howard here at 4, and he would have been behind a couple of these guys before the CFP. He is now in front of them because he did things that I didn't think he was capable of doing. I'll be totally honest with you. He made a ton of throws that I would not have pegged Will Howard to make. So he's one of those guys that it felt like the entire year was being held back just a little bit, from what he can be and what he was capable of being, and then they just let him loose. In the CFP, they let him be what he can be, and it's a special thing to watch. The athletic ability is going to be huge, and I think the bigger part of it is his mentality is going to be huge. Every NFL scout saw what they saw. They saw a guy walk into one of the most talented, one of the most veteran groups in the country and take over and become a leader of that team. That is not an easy thing to do, and definitely something that NFL GMs have clocked over the last little bit. So cannot wait to see what this kid can do. I am rooting for this kid to the nth degree because he's had a weird college career that probably wasn't appreciated enough at Kansas State or by Kansas State during his time, but I do think he's a guy that can make some really good plays, and as Anthony put it, fringe starter, great backup, definitely a area I could see Will Howard kind of falling into. Maybe, he gets that fringe starter role and then maybe he starts rolling, who knows, but a very talented kid, and regardless of if he's your fringe starter or he's a great backup, I think a great piece to add to any franchise out there. Jackson Dart is my number 3 quarterback. He is my QB3 as of right now. The athletic ability mixed with the arm strength is just too much to pass up on. Now, I do have some issues. I do think when you face a defensive line that is going to get after him, that is going to, force him to make some tough decisions and throw on the run and do all those different things, he likes to get a little creative. He likes to do some things that are a little bit out of the playbook, a little bit out of the ordinary, and it creates problems. There's no doubt about that. But I will say, in terms of all of these quarterbacks outside of these top 2 that we'll talk about here in a second, I think he has the best ability. I think he has the best ability to become an NFL starting quarterback. I think he has tons of work still left to do. And I think when you get him in that room, if he has 1 or 2 years to sit behind, I'm trying to pull a name out of my hat right now that would be gone after 2 years, and I can't quite do it. But a veteran quarterback that could be finding his way out of that team in a couple of years, maybe a Seahawks situation where you have Geno Smith for another year or two, then you move on to Jackson Dart. It could be a very interesting situation for him, no doubt about that. But the top 2, I'm going to put Shedeur Sanders at 2. Shedeur Sanders is my number 2 guy in this class. The ability is incredible. The accuracy is absolutely awesome. The worry is the same thing I had with Caleb Williams last year. And the reason that I had him kind of a 1A, 1B with Jaden Daniels going into last year was you're playing outside the offense a lot. And you're doing things that in the NFL just don't work. Running around and going back and forth across the field and then making a big-time throw doesn't work at the NFL level. And it especially doesn't work when you don't have the athletic ability of a Patrick Mahomes or of a Caleb Williams. He has a ton of athletic ability. It's not necessarily to take anything away of what Shedeur Sanders can do, but he's a little bit more of that prototypical pocket passer that those 2 guys weren't. So he can make stuff happen. And I frankly think he can become a very, very good quarterback at the next level. I think the tools are out of this world. I really just do think if you can keep him inside an offense, if you can make sure that he is making the right read, checking the ball down, not taking too much, not going for too much, you're going to have a quarterback that can be a guy for a very long time. That is a big if, as far as I'm concerned. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. I think he has all the ability in the world. I do worry about some of those superhero plays that he likes to make that just won't happen at the NFL level. Cam Ward, same exact problems I had with Shedeur Sanders, if I'm being totally honest with you. There's not a ton difference between these 2 guys. One thing I will say is I do think Cam Ward has more just outright arm talent. I think he has more of the ability to release the ball from different arm angles, to get the ball into different tight windows. I think he has a little bit more of that than Shedeur Sanders has. And then on top of that, I think he's just a little bit more effective playing within a system. He does get out of it every now and then. He does try to make those superhero plays, and some of that was just Miami's offensive line struggling at different for moments. Some of that was him just being who he is. So it's going to be interesting to watch. The footwork is solid, but not great. The arm talent is outright insane. He has absolutely elite instincts out there. That is one of the biggest things for me, is he feels like he knows where the rush is coming from before they've even started. So he's a very interesting guy, and I think there could be some bad moments. I think he is a guy that you could draft number 1 overall and then are drafting a quarterback in 3 years. He's also a guy that you could draft a quarterback number 1 overall and you're set for another 15. He's a very, very talented guy, and the biggest part about him is what's between the years. You are not going to find a guy that loves football that's going to play harder for you than Cam Ward is, and it's really hard to pass up on a guy like that. So I have Cam Ward as my number 1 guy. I think more than anything, the mentality puts him over the edge for me. If I'm going to draft a quarterback, I want a guy that just wants to play football, that wants to be as locked in as possible, make sure that, as he said with Shedeur Sanders when they were working out, he wants to be remembered as a football player. I love that. I definitely would gravitate towards that guy, and he is my top quarterback in this class. But it's a very funny class that could have, maybe Kyle McCord becomes the best quarterback in this class. Maybe Riley Leonard becomes the best quarterback in this class, because it's all over the place. If I'm being totally honest, at the end of the day, it might just come down to who can make the right plays and who can keep their wits about them when they're out there on the NFL field. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, let's talk about my top 10 offensive non-quarterback prospects, and then my top 10 defensive non-quarterback prospects in the draft right after this. So stick with us.